What would you do if a stranger in a fake uniform slapped your wife in broad daylight? For Jack Donnelly, a retired Navy SEAL, the answer was simple: fight back. And what happened next shook an entire neighborhood. The slap echoed louder than it should have. It wasn't just a sound. It was a spark, one that ripped through a quiet suburban street on a warm afternoon in Round Rock, Texas. Neighbors watering their lawns froze mid-motion, kids dropped their bikes on the sidewalk, and even the hum of a passing car seemed to stop, as if the world itself was shocked still. Trevor Langley, the man in the fake HOA uniform, stood over Hannah Donnelly, her hand to her cheek, her face flushed with both pain and outrage. He had just laid his hand on a woman who had done nothing but trim her rose bushes in her own yard. And in that instant, Trevor didn't realize that her husband, Jack Donnelly, a retired Navy SEAL with 20 years of service, was standing just steps away. Jack's entire body went cold, not with fear, but with a clarity that only men like him understand. He'd seen violence. He'd survived ambushes, fought in deserts, and carried wounded brothers out of firefights. But nothing could compare to the surge of anger he felt watching a stranger strike his wife on their own front lawn. "Did you just hit my wife?" Jack's voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp, like steel scraping on stone. Trevor laughed, a nervous twitch of bravado, and glanced back at the two men behind him, his so-called security team, both wearing knockoff uniforms with cheap plastic badges clipped to their belts. "She was out of line," Trevor sneered. "Breaking HOA rules. Someone's got to enforce them." "Enforce?" Jack took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Trevor's. "You think this is enforcement?" The neighbors shifted nervously. Mrs. Reynolds from across the street whispered, "They've been pushing everyone around. I knew this was coming." Her husband pulled her back toward their porch, not wanting to get caught in whatever was about to happen. Hannah's voice broke through the tension. "Jack, don't," she said, clutching her cheek, her voice trembling but firm. She wasn't asking him to stop. She was asking him to be careful. She knew her husband, knew what he was capable of, and she could see in his eyes that switch had flipped. Trevor smirked, mistaking Hannah's words as fear. "You people don't get it. We run this neighborhood now. You break the rules, there are consequences." Jack's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Consequences?" He tilted his head slightly. "For hitting my wife? You're about to learn what consequences really mean." Before Trevor could react, Jack moved. No wasted motion, no hesitation. 1 second he was standing there, the next Trevor's arm was twisted behind his back, his knees buckling under Jack's grip. The two other imposters rushed forward, but Jack was ready. A sharp kick to the first man's chest sent him crashing onto the grass, air knocked from his lungs. The second man swung wildly, but Jack sidestepped, grabbed his wrist and yanked him down hard. Gasps rippled through the gathering crowd. Some neighbors clapped hands over their mouths. Others whispered prayers. For months they had watched these self-proclaimed HOA enforcers strut around like they owned the place. No one had dared stand up to them. Until now. Trevor grunted in pain, his face pressed into the dirt as Jack leaned in close to his ear. "You're finished," he said quietly, each word deliberate. "You're never putting your hands on her, or anyone else, again." The other two scrambled to their feet, dazed and humiliated, trying to decide whether to run or fight. But Jack's stare locked them in place. They knew they were beaten. From across the street, a teenage boy pulled out his phone, recording everything. "Yo, this is crazy," he whispered, capturing the moment that would soon spread across the neighborhood like wildfire. And in the center of it all was Hannah, standing strong despite the sting on her face, her eyes filled with both pride and relief. She had seen her husband in battle mode before, once, years ago, when he came home from deployment and startled awake from a nightmare. But this time wasn't a dream. This was real, right here on their front lawn. As Trevor whimpered under Jack's grip, the distant sound of sirens began to echo closer. Someone had called the police. The crowd thickened, whispers growing louder. The balance of power in the neighborhood had shifted in a single afternoon. Jack released Trevor just enough to let him breathe, but kept his hand locked firmly. "You better pray those sirens are for you," he muttered. Because if they're not, I'm not finished. The sirens grew louder, turning onto their street, blue and red lights flashing against the houses. The real question was just beginning to form in everyone's mind. Who exactly were these men, and how had they gotten away with pretending to be in charge for so long? But before the truth could come out, the Donnellys had to face the long road of explaining how this all began. When Jack and Hannah Donnelly packed up their lives in Plano, Texas, they weren't running from anything. They were running towards something, a quieter life. After Jack's 20 years of service in the Navy SEALs, he was done with deployments, with hotel rooms that smelled of dust and nights where sleep came in fragments. Hannah had stood by him through it all, waiting, worrying, raising their 2 kids who were now off in college. They wanted a house where the air felt lighter, where the sound of birds in the morning replaced alarms and briefing rooms. The neighborhood in Round Rock seemed perfect. Wide streets lined with oaks, tidy lawns, a park just around the corner, and friendly smiles from families walking their dogs. Their house sat on a corner lot, modest but charming, with a porch swing Hannah had already claimed as her spot for evening tea. On their first night, she whispered, "Feels like we can finally breathe here." Jack kissed her temple and thought, "Yeah, maybe we can." At first, things really did seem peaceful. The Donnellys unpacked boxes, met a handful of neighbors, and got used to the slower rhythm of suburban life. Jack started going for morning runs through the neighborhood trails. Hannah spent her afternoons tending to her flower beds, her hands sunk into the soil as though she could plant their roots along with the roses. But peace is fragile, and it doesn't take much to break it. The first time Jack saw them, it was a Sunday morning. He was jogging back home when he noticed 3 men in matching uniforms, navy polo shirts with HOA security stitched in white across the chest. They weren't police uniforms, not even close, but they wore utility belts with flashlights, radios, and something that looked suspiciously like pepper spray. One of them stopped in front of a neighbor's house and wrote something down on a clipboard while lecturing a young couple about their recycling bins being out too early. Jack slowed down, watching from across the street. His instinct told him something was off. Their posture was too stiff, their eyes too aggressive. They weren't volunteers reminding people of community guidelines. They carried themselves like they owned the place. That night, over dinner, Jack told Hannah what he'd seen. "They're calling themselves security," he said, shaking his head. "But I don't buy it. Looks like a power trip." Hannah frowned. "You think they're legit? The HOA hired them, maybe?" "Maybe, but they don't look trained. More like guys who got uniforms off the internet." Jack pushed his plate back. "I don't like it." The next week, Hannah had her own encounter. She was walking back from the mailbox when one of the men, later she'd learn his name was Trevor Langley, stopped her. He looked at her mailbox, then at her and said, "Paint's peeling. That's a violation. Needs to be fixed within 10 days, or you'll be fined." Hannah blinked. "Excuse me?" "The HOA's been around here before, but they usually send letters. They don't send people door to door." Trevor leaned in, too close. "That's how it used to work. We're stepping things up. We're not afraid to enforce the rules now." She told Jack that evening, her voice laced with irritation. "He talked to me like I was some criminal." "Over paint." "Paint!" Jack's jaw tightened. "I'll handle it. Don't let them push you around." But when he called the HOA office the next day, the receptionist sounded confused. "Sir, we don't have a security team. We've never had one. If someone's claiming that, they're not with us." That was the moment the air shifted for Jack. He had dealt with liars, with men pretending to be what they weren't, and he knew the danger of letting them operate unchecked. Soon after, neighbors started dropping hints in hushed tones. The Reynolds across the street admitted the HOA cops had threatened to fine them for having too many lawn decorations. The Parkers said one of the men had shouted at their teenage son for playing basketball in the driveway past 9 o'clock. Everyone had a story, but no one had stood up to them. Fear had settled in, quiet and suffocating. One evening, Jack walked out to water the lawn. Across the street, he saw Trevor again, clipboard in hand, pointing at another neighbor's car parked on the curb. Jack called out, "Hey, you! You work for the HOA?" Trevor straightened, smirked, and replied, "We work for the community. Someone has to keep things in order." Jack didn't like the way his words carried, that mix of arrogance and threat. But he also knew charging in too soon could make things worse. He needed to watch, wait, gather more before taking action. Hannah, though, couldn't hide her unease. "It feels like they're circling," she whispered one night as they sat on the porch swing. "Like they're just waiting for someone to push back." Jack squeezed her hand. "Let them circle. They have no idea who they're dealing with." But Hannah didn't know how soon that pushback would come, or how violent it would get. By the third week in their new home, the Donnellys had started hearing the stories in fragments. They weren't delivered loudly or in full detail, more like pieces of gossip shared when no one else was within earshot. At first, Jack thought people were exaggerating, but the more he listened, the more it added up. Something was festering in this neighborhood, and it wore a cheap navy polo with HOA security stitched across the chest. It was Hannah who first picked up on the whispers. She was bringing a pie dish back to Margaret Reynolds, their elderly neighbor across the street, when Margaret lowered her voice and said, "Those men came here last month. Told me my curtains didn't match the exterior paint scheme. Said if I didn't replace them, I'd be fined $100. Hannah blinked. "Your curtains? How would that even be a rule?" "That's what I asked," Margaret said, glancing nervously at her front window as if the men might suddenly appear. "But when I pushed back, one of them leaned over my porch rail and said, 'Rules are rules. Don't make us come back.'" Hannah felt a chill settle in her chest. She thanked Margaret, but the story gnawed at her all afternoon. When she told Jack later, he exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. "That's intimidation," he said flatly. The next whisper came from the Parkers. Their teenage son, Devon, had been out shooting hoops one night when one of the imposters strode up and barked at him to "shut it down." Devon, a lanky 17-year-old, shrugged and kept bouncing. The man snatched the ball and threw it into the bushes, growling, "Driveways aren't for games." Consider this your warning. When Jack heard that, he shook his head. These guys aren't just pretending. They're escalating. Word trickled further from the Chen family down the street. Their mailbox had been tagged with a fake citation notice signed by HOA enforcement. It claimed their front shrubs were non-compliant. Mr. Chen, who had lived there for over 10 years, went to a real HOA board meeting to ask about it. The board members were baffled. "We've never issued such a letter," they told him. That was when Jack knew the Donnellys weren't dealing with an overzealous neighborhood watch. They were dealing with imposters running a scam of authority. One Saturday afternoon, Jack and Hannah sat on their porch when a soft knock came at the side gate. It was Carla Park, a woman in her 40s who lived 2 houses down. She looked both nervous and relieved to see them. "I heard what happened the other day," Carla said, shifting her weight from foot to foot. "With Trevor talking to you about the mailbox." Hannah nodded slowly. "You've dealt with them too?" Carla let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, we all have. Everyone on this street. They told me my kids' bikes had to be stored inside or we'd be fined. When I asked for the rule in writing, one of them leaned in and said, 'Don't test us.' My husband wanted to report it, but we've seen how aggressive they can get. It's easier to just give in." Jack leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You've all been letting them push you around because you're scared." Carla's eyes dropped. "We don't have military training like you, Jack. We're just regular people trying to live here." Jack softened his tone. "You don't need training to tell the truth. You just need to stand together. Bullies only win when no one pushes back." Carla gave him a small, grateful smile before heading home, but Jack could see the weight she carried. It was the same weight hanging over the entire street. Everyone pretending nothing was wrong because standing up felt too risky. That evening, Hannah tried to lighten the mood with a home-cooked dinner, but Jack barely touched his plate. He was staring out the window, his mind elsewhere. "You're thinking about them again?" Hannah said softly. "I can't help it," Jack admitted. "They're preying on decent people. People who don't know how to fight back. It's only a matter of time before something worse happens." Hannah set down her fork. "What if we just kept our heads down? Stayed out of it?" Jack turned to her, his expression hard. "If we do that, then we're no better than the ones letting it happen. And the day they lay a hand on someone, that'll be the day everything changes." Hannah didn't answer. She knew he was right, but she also knew how far Jack was willing to go when pushed. Later that night, as they sat on the porch swing, a car slowed to a stop in front of their house. The window rolled down, and Trevor's voice carried across the street. "Pretty flowers, Mrs. Donnelly. Be a shame if someone reported them for blocking the walkway." Jack stood, every muscle tense. But before he could move, the car sped off, laughter echoing into the night. Hannah's hand gripped his arm. "Please," she whispered, "don't start something yet." Jack clenched his jaw, staring at the fading taillights. His voice was low but certain. They just did. But before Jack could act, the confrontation would come to his doorstep in a way no one expected. The first time Jack squared up face to face with Trevor Langley, it wasn't planned. It was a Tuesday afternoon, hot enough that the air shimmered above the pavement. Jack had just pulled into the driveway after grabbing groceries when he noticed Trevor and his two buddies parked in front of the Chen's house again. Clipboard in hand, Trevor was circling their front yard like a vulture, scribbling notes while muttering to the couple about non-compliant shrubbery. Jack set his grocery bags down on the hood of his truck and walked over. "Hey!" he called out, his voice even but firm. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Trevor turned, his smirk quick to return when he saw it was Jack. "Conducting inspections. Standard HOA security procedure." "You wouldn't understand," Jack folded his arms. "Funny thing, I called the actual HOA office last week. They said they don't have a security team. So why don't you explain that?" The two men behind Trevor shifted uncomfortably, but Trevor didn't flinch. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "We're the ones keeping this place in order. The HOA doesn't have the guts to enforce the rules. We do." Jack let the silence hang for a moment. His gaze didn't waver. Years of reading opponents in combat zones had taught him that the loudest men were often the weakest. "You walk around here in cheap uniforms, barking at people like you're cops." "But I've been in places where real authority mattered. And trust me, you don't have it." Trevor's grin faltered, if only for a second. "Careful, Donnelly. This isn't the military. You don't get to call the shots here. I don't need to," Jack replied. "But if you put your hands on one more neighbor, you'll wish you never set foot on this street." The standoff was thick enough to cut. Behind them, Mr. Chen stood frozen on his porch, his wife clutching his arm. No one moved. Then Trevor leaned in slightly, his voice low but taunting. "We'll see how tough you are when your wife's the one breaking the rules." Jack's jaw flexed, but he didn't take the bait. Instead, he took a step back and raised his voice just enough for the Chens to hear. "If anyone gives you trouble again, you come straight to me. Don't let these clowns intimidate you." Trevor's eyes darkened. "You just made yourself a target." "Then aim carefully," Jack shot back before turning to grab his groceries. That night, Jack replayed the scene over and over. He told Hannah what had been said, leaving nothing out. Her face paled when he repeated Trevor's words about her. "He mentioned me?" she asked quietly, setting her mug of tea down with trembling hands. Jack reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "They're bluffing. Bullies always do. But I'm not letting them near you." "Jack, you can't fight everyone," she whispered. "This isn't a battlefield." "It's our home. It's both now," he answered. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with something Hannah had seen before in his deployments, the look of a man ready for whatever storm was coming. The following days brought smaller skirmishes. Trevor's crew left fake warning slips taped to mailboxes. They followed neighbors during their evening walks, jotting down violations in their clipboards. Once Jack caught them lingering outside his own fence, pretending to measure the height of the grass. He walked out and stood silently on the porch until they left. The neighbors started noticing. Some whispered thanks to Jack in passing. Others avoided eye contact, too afraid of drawing the imposter's attention. The street had become divided, those who hoped Jack would protect them, and those who just wanted the problem to disappear on its own. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky orange, Carla Park stopped by again. She spoke in hushed urgency. "Jack, you have to be careful. I overheard Trevor bragging. He said he was going to make an example out of someone's this week." Jack's stomach tightened. Did he say who? Carla hesitated, then nodded. He mentioned Hannah. Jack felt the air leave his lungs in a slow, controlled breath. Thank you, Carla. I'll take it from here. That night, while Hannah slept, Jack sat in the living room with the lights off, staring out at the street. Every sound outside caught his attention. A car door, a barking dog, footsteps on the sidewalk. His instincts screamed at him to act, but he knew rushing in too early could backfire. He muttered to himself, barely audible, "If he lays a finger on her, I won't hold back." But Trevor wasn't planning on waiting long. His so-called example would happen sooner than anyone imagined. Saturday afternoon carried a strange tension. The air was warm, the kind of sticky Texas heat that clung to your clothes, but Hannah felt restless enough to keep herself busy. She slipped on her wide-brimmed hat, grabbed her gloves, and went out to trim the rose bushes along the front walkway. Gardening always steadied her nerves. The simple act of shaping the blooms, of coaxing order from nature, reminded her of the peace they had come here to find. She knelt by the flower bed, clipping carefully, when a shadow stretched across the grass. Hannah looked up, and there he was, Trevor Langley, standing too close, his clipboard tucked under his arm like a badge of honor. Two of his officers lingered near the sidewalk, arms crossed. "Afternoon, Mrs. Donnelly," Trevor drawled. "Looks like we've got a problem here." Hannah straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her gloves. "What kind of problem?" "HOA Regulation 12C, Trevor said, tapping his clipboard. "No landscaping that obstructs a walkway. Your roses are creeping too far out. Someone could get scratched." Hannah arched an eyebrow. "Those roses have been here since we moved in." No one's complained. And as far as I know, the HOA doesn't send men like you door to door. Trevor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Times change. We're cracking down. If you don't fix this by tomorrow, there'll be a fine." Hannah crossed her arms, standing her ground. "You don't scare me, Trevor." "I called the HOA myself. They said you're not official. You're just pretending?" The smirk dropped from his face. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think you're brave, huh? Talking back? Maybe your husband filled your head with that Navy toughness. But you're not him." Her pulse quickened, but she kept her tone steady. "And you're not security. You're a bully in a polo shirt." Trevor's jaw twitched. For a second he just stared at her, the air thick with his anger. Then it happened. Fast, ugly. His hand came up and cracked across her cheek. The sound was sharp, brutal, louder than the chirping cicadas. Gasps erupted from across the street. Mrs. Reynolds, watering her lawn, dropped her hose. Carla Park froze on her porch, hand covering her mouth. The slap wasn't just physical. It was a public act meant to humiliate, to dominate. Hannah staggered back, her hand flying to her cheek. Pain seared across her face, but she refused to let tears fall. She stared at Trevor, her voice shaking but fierce. "You'll regret that." And that was when she heard the voice she knew better than her own heartbeat. "Did you just hit my wife?" Jack had been standing on the porch, arms folded, watching the entire exchange. He had held himself back, giving Hannah space to stand her ground. But when Trevor struck her, something inside Jack snapped into sharp focus. Trevor turned, forcing a laugh. She was out of line. Somebody had to put her in check. Jack stepped forward, his movement slow, deliberate. "Somebody? You think you're somebody? You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The other two imposters shifted uneasily. One whispered, "Trevor, maybe we should back off." "Shut up," Trevor snapped, trying to keep control. But his voice cracked just enough to betray him. Jack closed the distance, stopping just inches from Trevor. His voice was calm, almost eerily so. "You've got two choices. Apologize to her right now, or I make sure you never touch anyone again." Trevor sneered. "You think you scare me, soldier boy? You're retired. You're nothing now." That was the last straw. Jack's fist shot forward, connecting with Trevor's jaw. The man stumbled back, hitting the ground hard. Before the others could react, Jack moved like lightning, He grabbed the first by the collar, twisting his arm and flipping him onto the grass with a grunt. The second swung wildly, but Jack blocked it, delivering a sharp elbow that sent the man sprawling. Neighbors gasped, some cheering under their breath. For months they'd lived under the shadow of these impostors. Now they were watching them fall apart in seconds at the hands of someone who had finally had enough. Trevor groaned, clutching his jaw as Jack towered over him. "You think this is over?" Trevor spat blood onto the pavement. Jack leaned down, his voice low and controlled. "It's over when I say it's over. And trust me, it's over." The sirens came faint at first, then louder, blue and red lights flashing down the street. Someone had already called the police. Neighbors gathered, murmuring, phones recording every detail. Hannah, still holding her cheek, walked over and placed a hand on Jack's arm. Her touch softened him instantly, grounding him. She whispered, "I'm okay." "You did what you had to do." Jack turned to her, eyes still hard but filled with something else now. Love, protection, fury barely contained. He kissed her forehead gently before straightening again, waiting for the officers to arrive. But while the police would soon reveal the impostors for what they were, the neighborhood itself was about to split wide open. The police sirens were still blocks away when Jack Donnelly shifted his stance, ready for whatever came next. Trevor Langley was on the ground, clutching his jaw, blood running down his chin. His two sidekicks stumbled around like amateurs, one cradling a sprained wrist, the other trying to catch his breath after taking a knee to the ribs. Neighbors spilled out onto porches and sidewalks. Phones were raised, recording everything. This wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. It was a public showdown, and Jack stood at the center of it. Trevor spat onto the grass and struggled to his feet. His arrogance hadn't left him, but his voice shook when he said, "You think you're some kind of hero? You think people are going to thank you for this? You don't know who you're messing with." Jack took one step closer, his presence alone silencing the street. "No," he said, his voice calm and cold. "You don't know who you're messing with. You laid your hands on my wife. That's something you don't walk away from." Trevor's buddies made one last attempt to rush him, but Jack's training kicked in. He moved with precision, no wasted motion. The first swung blindly. Jack sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, and twisted until the man cried out in pain, dropping to his knees. The second lunged forward, but Jack countered with a sharp strike to the chest that sent the air whooshing out of him. He collapsed onto the grass, wheezing, hands clutching his ribs. The crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs. Some neighbors cheered under their breath, others covered their children's eyes. Hannah stood a few feet back, her hand still pressed to her stinging cheek, watching her husband transform into the man she'd seen only in flashes, the soldier who knew how to end a fight in seconds. Jack knelt beside Trevor, who was now trembling more from fear than pain. His voice dropped to a growl. "You ever lay a hand on her again, or anyone else in this neighborhood, and you won't be worrying about fines. You'll be worrying about walking." Trevor tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. "You don't scare me," he muttered, though his eyes darted nervously to the crowd. Jack leaned closer. "Then let me make this clear. I don't bluff." The sound of sirens grew louder, lights bouncing off the houses as police cruisers turned onto the street. The impostors froze, their earlier bravado melting away. One of the neighbors, Carla Park, stepped forward, her voice shaky but determined. "I saw it." He slapped her. "We've all seen what they've been doing." She pointed at Trevor. "He's been harassing us for months." Other voices rose behind her. Mr. Chen shouted, "They came after me and my wife!" "Said we owed fines that didn't exist," Mrs. Reynolds added. "They threatened me over my curtains. I've been afraid to say anything." The officers pulled up, tires crunching on the asphalt, doors flinging open. Two deputies stepped out, hands resting on their holsters. One of them, Officer Ramirez, took in the scene with wide eyes. The three impostors battered and bruised, Jack standing tall in the middle of the yard, neighbors surrounding him. "What happened here?" Ramirez demanded. Before Jack could answer, Carla spoke up again. "Those men aren't HOA security. They're fakes. They've been terrorizing this street, and today she pointed at Trevor, hit Hannah Donnelly right in the face." Ramirez turned to Jack. "Sir, is that true?" Jack nodded. "My wife was trimming the roses." He came at her with some nonsense about violations, then struck her. I stepped in. Hannah stepped forward, her voice clear despite the redness on her cheek. He hit me. In front of everyone, Ramirez's jaw tightened. He turned toward Trevor. You got anything to say to that? Trevor opened his mouth, but no words came out. The other deputies moved in, patting the men down, pulling fake-eyed from their pockets and stripping off the knockoff badges. One deputy shook his head. These are bogus. Not even close to real. As the imposters were lined up against the squad car, the neighbors buzzed with relief and anger. Months of bottled-up fear came pouring out in overlapping voices. They threatened my kid. They tried to fine us for nothing. We were scared to even go outside. Jack stood silently, his eyes on Hannah. She gave him a small nod, proud, grateful, but shaken. He slipped an arm around her shoulders, steadying her as if to remind her she wasn't alone. Ramirez approached Jack. We'll need to take statements. Looks like you did a number on them. Jack's tone was steady. I didn't hit them until after they put their hands on my wife. Ramirez studied him for a moment, then nodded. Given the witnesses, I don't think you'll have much to worry about. Behind them, Trevor was shoved into the back of a cruiser, his face twisted in rage. This isn't over, he shouted, his voice muffled by the car door slamming shut. Jack didn't even flinch. He just stared at the car as it pulled away, his arm still wrapped protectively around Hannah. But as the blue and red lights faded down the street, the neighbors knew the fight wasn't just about 3 imposters. It was about reclaiming their community from fear. When the squad cars pulled away with Trevor and his crew in the back, the neighborhood didn't scatter the way it usually did after police business. People lingered in clusters on the sidewalks, whispering, shaking their heads, replaying what they had just seen. For months, everyone had avoided confrontation, tiptoeing around the men in the fake uniforms. Now the silence had been shattered, and the street hummed with a different kind of energy. Anger, mixed with relief. Hannah leaned against Jack, still holding her cheek. He guided her gently toward the porch steps, but before they could sit, Carla Park approached. Her voice trembled, but there was fire in her eyes. You did what we've all been too scared to do. I don't know how to thank you. Jack shook his head. Don't thank me. Just don't stay quiet anymore. That's how people like them get away with it. Carla glanced at Hannah's cheek, her expression darkening. I should have spoken up sooner. We all should have. Other neighbors gathered closer. Mr. Chen stepped forward, clearing his throat. They came to my house 3 times, said my mailbox was out of compliance. I paid them $50 thinking it was real. My wife told me not to, but I didn't want trouble. His shoulders slumped with shame. You're not the only one, Mrs. Reynolds added quickly. They got me for $200 over curtains. I was afraid they'd vandalize my house if I didn't pay. The crowd grew louder with overlapping confessions. Fake fines, threats of property damage, harassment of kids playing outside. Every story added another layer to the picture. A neighborhood held hostage by men who had no authority, only intimidation. Jack listened, arms crossed, eyes scanning the group. When the voices finally quieted, he said, You all knew something was wrong, but fear kept you in line. I get it. Not everyone's trained to push back. But silence is what gave them power. From the back of the crowd, a voice called out. It was Tom Alvarez, a neighbor Jack had barely spoken to before. Easy for you to say. You're a SEAL. You've been through combat. The rest of us? We've got jobs. Families. We can't afford to get hurt or dragged into fights. Jack locked eyes with him. I'm not asking anyone here to fight. I'm saying stop pretending nothing's wrong. Report it. Speak up. Stand with each other. One man standing alone can be ignored. A neighborhood standing together can't. Tom looked away, but the words hung in the air. Hannah spoke up then, her voice stronger than anyone expected. When he hit me, I wasn't just hurt. I was humiliated. He wanted me to feel small, but I didn't. Because I knew Jack was right there, and because I know none of us should have to live in fear of men like that. If you let people like Trevor run things, they'll take and take until there's nothing left to give. There was a moment of silence. Then Margaret Reynolds stepped forward, leaning on her cane. She's right. I've lived here 30 years. This is my home, And I'll be damned if I let 3 punks in fake uniforms tell me how to live." Her voice cracked, but her words were firm. The small crowd murmured in agreement. For the first time in months, the fear seemed to be thinning, replaced by something sturdier. Jack put an arm around Hannah, drawing her closer. "You all saw what happened today. They're gone for now, but don't think they won't try something else. The police can handle the charges, but the real fight is making sure nobody like them ever thinks this neighborhood is easy prey again." Carla nodded. "Then maybe it's time we had a meeting. Not the HOA board, but us, everyone who actually lives here. We've got to talk about how to look out for each other." Mr. Chen raised a tentative hand. "I'll host. My garage is big enough. We should do it soon, before people start slipping back into silence." A murmur of agreement spread through the group. People who had spent months avoiding eye contact were now talking, planning, finding a kind of unity that hadn't existed before. As the neighbors began to drift back to their homes, Hannah finally sank onto the porch swing. She leaned her head against Jack's shoulder, her voice soft. "You think this really changes anything?" Jack looked out at the street, the last rays of sun painting the rooftops. "Yeah, it changes everything." Fear kept them strong. That fear's gone now. For the first time since moving to Round Rock, Hannah felt something she hadn't in weeks. Safety. Not because the threat was gone, but because the people around them were finally waking up. But the night wasn't finished yet. Because when the police came back with news about Trevor's past, the neighborhood would realize just how close they'd been to real danger. By the time the last squad car circled back down the block an hour later, the neighborhood was quieter, but not calm. Porch lights glowed up and down the street, casting long shadows across driveways where neighbors still lingered in small clusters, replaying every detail of what had happened. 2 officers approached Jack and Hannah on their porch. The taller of the two, Sergeant Kyle Anderson, carried himself with the weary posture of someone who'd seen plenty of nonsense, but rarely this kind. His partner, Deputy Lisa Ward, flipped open a small notebook as they walked up. "Mr. and Mrs. Donnelly," Anderson began, "we need to get some formal statements, but before we do, you should probably know, those 3 men we took in? Not their first stunt." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Meaning what?" Anderson leaned against the railing, lowering his voice. "We ran their IDS. Trevor Langley's got priors, fraud, intimidation, even an old assault charge out of El Paso. He's been bouncing around neighborhoods pulling schemes like this for years. The uniforms? Ordered online. Fake badges, fake citations. All of it's part of a racket." Hannah's stomach turned. "So he's done this before?" Ward nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Different city, same playbook. Pretend to be HOA enforcers, threaten residents with fines, shake people down for money. Most folks don't question it. Until tonight, it looks like no one's pushed back this hard." Jack exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "How long would they have kept it up here if nobody said anything?" Anderson shrugged grimly. "As long as they could. People freeze when they think they're dealing with authority, even if it's fake. They see a badge, a clipboard, and they just comply." From across the yard, Carla Park stepped closer, folding her arms. "So what happens now? Do they just get a slap on the wrist and come back in a few weeks?" Ward's tone was steady. "No, this time it sticks. We've got multiple witness statements, video evidence, and Mrs. Donnelly's assault. They'll face charges, impersonating an officer, harassment, assault, maybe extortion if we can prove the money they collected. They're not walking away from this easily." The reassurance settled over the group like a thin blanket. It didn't erase the anger, but it dulled the sharpest edge of fear. Still, Jack wasn't satisfied. "What about the neighbors they scammed? Do they get their money back?" Anderson hesitated. "That'll depend on the investigation. But your testimony, and the neighbors, will go a long way." Hannah shifted uncomfortably. "I just want to make sure no one else goes through this. It's not just the money. It's the way he looked at me, like I was nothing." Her words hit the crowd harder than anything Jack had said. People murmured agreement, some nodding, some wiping their eyes. Ward closed her notebook. "We'll be in touch with updates. In the meantime, don't be surprised if we're back around. We'll need statements from everyone. And Mr. Donnelly." She met Jack's eyes, You handled yourself better than most would have, but next time, let us take it from here." Jack gave a short nod. "Next time, maybe you'll get here before my wife gets hit." Anderson winced, but didn't argue. He knew there was truth in the words. The officers headed back to their cruiser, leaving the neighbors to digest what they'd heard. Margaret Reynolds was the first to speak, her voice shaky, but resolute. Fraud in El Paso, extortion, and here we were, thinking it was just stricter HOA rules. "I feel foolish," Jack turned to her, his voice steady. "You're not foolish. They counted on people assuming they were real. That's what predators do. They hide behind authority. The shame isn't on you. It's on them." For the first time in weeks, Margaret straightened her posture a little, her cane steady against the pavement. Tom Alvarez muttered, "So what? We just wait for court dates while they sit in jail? What if they make bail?" Jack didn't sugarcoat it. "Then we stay vigilant." But now the police know. The system knows. And most importantly, he swept a hand toward the neighbors gathered around, we know. They can't hide in plain sight anymore. The group lingered, talking in low voices, but the tension had shifted. What once felt like a neighborhood trapped in silence was now something else. Raw, open, ready to act. Hannah squeezed Jack's hand as they finally went inside. Her cheeks still ached, but she carried herself taller. "I never thought roses and pruning shears would lead to police cruisers on our street," she said softly. Jack half smiled. "Life has a way of testing us where we least expect it." He paused, looking back through the window at their neighbors still talking. "But tonight proved something. This street isn't powerless anymore." But while the imposters were gone for now, the neighbors still had to decide what came next, and whether they'd let fear creep back in or build something stronger together. 2 days after the arrests, the Chen family's garage was packed tighter than it had ever been. Folding chairs lined the concrete floor, kids perched on bicycles near the back, and neighbors who barely spoke to one another before were now shoulder to shoulder. The smell of brewed coffee and store-bought cookies lingered in the air, but no one was here for refreshments. They were here because the thin layer of safety they once assumed was permanent had been ripped away, and everyone knew it. Mr. Chen cleared his throat, tapping a spoon against a mug to call the room to order. "Thank you all for coming," he said nervously. "We've lived here a long time, but I don't think we've ever gathered like this. Not for block parties, not for holidays, certainly not for something like this." Carla Park was the first to stand. She brushed her dark hair behind her ear and looked around the room. "We all knew something was off. We let it slide because it was easier than confronting it. But Hannah got slapped in her own yard, and if Jack hadn't been there—" She stopped, emotion catching in her throat. If he hadn't stepped in, who knows how far Trevor would have gone? A murmur rippled across the room. Hannah sat quietly in the front row, her cheek still faintly discolored, but healing. Jack rested a hand over hers, steadying her as eyes turned in her direction. Mrs. Reynolds raised her hand timidly. "I was scared. I admit it. I paid them money I didn't owe because I thought if I didn't, they'd hurt me. I'm not proud of it, but I thought, better me than my family." Jack stood slowly, his presence commanding the room without effort. "No one here should feel ashamed. You were targeted. They used fear like a weapon. But here's the truth. When you stay silent, fear wins. When you speak up, it loses power. What happened to Hannah was terrible, but it forced us to see that we can't afford silence anymore." Tom Alvarez leaned forward in his chair, arms crossed. "Easy for you to say, Jack. You're trained for this. You've seen combat. What about the rest of us? We're accountants, teachers, retirees. We don't have your skills." Jack nodded. "You're right. You don't have my training, but you don't need it to stand together. Bullies survive by isolating people, making you think you're alone. When they slapped Hannah, everyone saw it. Everyone knew it was wrong. That's what broke their power. Not just me, not just Hannah, but the fact that the whole street finally saw the truth." The room fell silent, his words sinking in. Hannah spoke next, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "When Trevor hit me, I wasn't just angry. I felt small, humiliated, like I didn't matter. And then I looked around and saw my neighbors watching, and I realized this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. We can't live in a neighborhood where fear decides how we act. Margaret Reynolds pushed herself up with her cane. She's right. I've been here 30 years. I'm not about to let some imposters drive me out of my own home, but it shouldn't have taken Hannah getting hit for us to wake up. Carla looked around the garage, her voice firmer now. So, what do we do? Waiting for police isn't enough. We need to look out for each other. If we see something off, we talk. If someone gets harassed, we don't whisper. We confront it together. A few heads nodded, but Tom still looked doubtful. And if someone else shows up? Another Trevor. What then? Jack answered without hesitation. Then we deal with it together. Not by fighting, by standing united. If Trevor had walked down this street and seen 30 neighbors watching instead of one woman alone, he never would have tried it. That's the difference between fear and strength. The conversation turned into planning. The neighbors decided to set up a communication chain. Phone numbers exchanged, a group chat created, a rotation of evening walks where people checked in on each other. It wasn't about replacing the police. It was about refusing to be silent prey again. For the first time, laughter even broke out when Mr. Chen joked, "If anyone ever tries to find me for my bushes again, I'll send them straight to Jack." The room eased into a lighter mood, but Jack didn't let it end without one last word. He stood again, scanning the faces of people who, just a week ago, had been strangers. This neighborhood is only as strong as we make it. You don't need uniforms or badges to protect it. You need courage, honesty, and the willingness to stand up for each other. That's how you stop men like Trevor from coming back. The garage filled with applause, not thunderous, but sincere. People left that night with more than phone numbers and plans. They left with a sense of belonging, of shared responsibility, something they hadn't felt in months. As the Donnellys walked home under the glow of porch lights, Hannah squeezed Jack's hand. "You think they'll stick with it?" Jack looked around at the neighbors dispersing into their homes, voices carrying in the warm night air. They've had a wake-up call, and once you've seen fear for what it is, you can't unsee it. But as strong as the neighborhood felt that night, the lesson wasn't finished. The Donnellys still had to reckon with what this fight meant for their own lives. The morning after the neighborhood meeting, sunlight spilled across the Donnellys' kitchen table. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel like the same house they'd moved into weeks ago. Something had shifted. Hannah sipped her tea, her cheek almost fully healed, and stared out the window at the roses she'd been tending when Trevor first confronted her. She touched the spot gently, as if to remind herself of how close fear had come to taking root in their lives. Jack joined her at the table, setting down 2 plates of scrambled eggs. "You didn't eat much last night," he said softly. "I wasn't hungry," she admitted. "But today feels different." Lighter Jack nodded. "Because they're gone?" "Because we're not alone anymore," she replied. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the past few weeks hung in the air, but so did the relief of knowing the street had finally stood together. Later that day, as Jack walked the block, neighbors waved at him with more warmth than before. Margaret Reynolds sat on her porch knitting, no longer glancing nervously over her shoulder. The Chens trimmed their hedges without fear of another fake citation being slapped on their mailbox. Kids were outside again, bouncing basketballs, riding bikes, laughing freely. The neighborhood felt alive in a way it hadn't since the Donnellys first arrived. Carla Park caught Jack halfway down the street. "I just wanted to say thank you again. You didn't just stand up for Hannah. You stood up for all of us." Jack shook his head. "I did what anyone should have done." Carla smiled faintly. "Maybe, but not everyone would have had the courage." Her words stayed with him as he walked home. He wasn't blind to the truth. His military training had given him the tools to act decisively when others couldn't. But he also knew this fight hadn't been about combat. It had been about community. About people remembering they had a voice. That evening, Hannah joined him on the porch swing, resting her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever wonder if we moved here for a reason?" she asked quietly. Jack tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "We wanted peace, a fresh start. But maybe we were meant to be here, to help this neighborhood find its strength again." Jack looked out at the street, the warm glow of porch lights flickering on as the sun dipped low. Life has a way of putting you where you're needed, he said. Sometimes peace isn't something you find. Sometimes you have to build it. Hannah smiled, her eyes soft but resolute. And we did. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was comforting, the kind of silence that came from knowing you'd faced the storm and come out stronger. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. The group chat buzzed with updates. A lost dog found, suspicious vehicles reported, bake sales announced. Neighbors who once kept to themselves now checked in on one another. The Chens hosted another gathering, this time just for fun. Laughter spilled out of garages, kids played tag in the yards, and for the first time in a long time, Round Rock felt like a real community again. Trevor and his crew faced charges: impersonating officers, harassment, assault. News of their scheme even made the local paper, with a headline that read, "Fake HOA enforcers exposed by neighborhood residents." The article mentioned the Donnellys by name, though Jack downplayed his role when reporters called. "It wasn't just me," he told them. "It was all of us, finally standing together." One evening, as the Donnellys strolled down the street, Hannah paused to admire the roses she had replanted.